Hey man, what it is, this is Deem and I am your host, and this is By Any Means. There go to Cash App, $ Dean by any means. There go to PayPal, at Dean by any means. Y'all already know what I'm about to say. I don't care if you leave $1, $10, $1,000. It is much, much, much appreciated. You right there. Don't be an eavesdropper. Hit that like button, man. Come on, man. Come on. Hit that like button. Yo, we've heard this saying for years now. I'm a fan of boxing. I just want the best fighters to fight the best. I just want the best to fight the best. And what I've come to realize since making a YouTube channel and really being back into, like, I've always loved boxing, but seeing that boxing had platforms and was taking off. You know, boxing has as far as content creating and media and social media, boxing is on the upswing, I'll say. The part that hurts me, y'all, is that we say that we want the best to fight the best, but what I really come to realize, y'all, we don't want the best fighting. We don't want the best fighters fighting. We just want to argue about the best fighters fighting. We'll make I've heard narratives about send a contract, y'all. Let's break this down. I've heard narratives about send a contract. Then a guy sends a contract, another guy can deny the contract, say they want to be with their family, and a guy who sent the contract still get blamed. You can't, only in boxing. You ask a guy to send something. He does what you ask him to do. Then the other guy that you asked him to send it to reneges and still blames the guy that you asked to send the contract in the first place. Tell me, how does that work? What that proves to me, that people only want to argue about the best fighting the best. They're not trying to be objective. They're not trying to get to the conclusion. They're not trying to get to the solution. It's much more fun to argue about people not fighting. It's much more fun to argue about a duck, this a duck, that's a duck. It's much more fun to do it instead of actually having a perspective. And this is why a lot of guys don't make it on YouTube. This is why a lot of boxing fans get caught and get embarrassed out here on panels and get cooked and got to get mad and want to take it to physical altercations, because you're not using critical thinking. If you got a standard, you got to stick with that standard throughout everything. And only minute circumstances can change the way you feel about X, Y, and Z, but they have to be substantial. Yeah, a guy could send a guy a contract, but if the guy is injured, then and he can't do nothing about it, then it is what it is. Or a guy could send a guy a contract, but if he gonna get stripped, blase blah, you got to consider that. These are all things to consider, but as far as when it's free and clear, and it ain't nothing stopping in between, both promoters or whatever, everything's aligned, and a guy just says, nah, I don't want to fight, there's no way you blame the guy that was trying to make the fight. We don't want to see the best fighters fighting. We want to argue about the best fighters fighting. That's what we like to do in boxing. Instead of actually talking about in the ring skills and this, that, and the third, we want to talk about what this person said, what that person said. And I'm all for it too. But when I talk about it, it's coming from my objective of being consistent the whole time. So if I'm going to talk about him doing that, I'm going to talk about this person doing that. If I got to talk about it, if I put a standard out there prior and a guy doesn't, prime example. If Gervonta Davis never sends a contract to Lomachenko, I got to be on Gervonta Davis about him never trying to make that fight. He can't just get a pass on that. I have to speak on that. Let's go to David Benavidez and Canelo Alvarez, y'all. Canelo Alvarez has been going to get stripped by the IBF. We'll talk about that in a later video. But I want to show you what I mean by we don't actually want the best fighters fighting. We want to argue about the best fighters fighting. Dean, what you mean? David Benavidez moves up to 175 because the WBC put his back against the corner and tried to they made him pick a division that he's going to be the interim champ in to be the mandatory for either one of those divisions. If you understand, type understand. Okay. So he's going to go do that, right? David Benavidez has been in that division before Canelo even got to 168. David Benavidez has been trying to make this fight the whole time. Now, we criticize other fighters for not trying to make fights. Then a guy that actually is known to have signed contracts has been trying to make fights this whole time. This is known. He still get blamed, and people use narratives talking about why he ain't activate his mandatory, which he did because the WBC said they was going to make that they was going to mandate that fight last October. They were supposed to mandate that fight. They put a statement out there saying they're going to mandate that fight. It never did. David Benavidez don't have control over what the WBC decides to do. And we all know the WBC is in favor of Canelo. But somehow David Benavidez still get talked about crazy. Who he fight? He ain't on Canelo level. What he bring to the table? But then say we want guys to try to make the fights. But then we'll sit up there and talk about, well, Tank's the A side. Shakur can't do nothing. That's not true. David Benavidez has. David Benavidez has done stuff. Oh, what you mean the B side can't do nothing? That is not true. The B side could be very active in trying to make a fight. What are you talking about? We don't want the best fighters fighting. We want to argue about the best fighters fighting. Devin Haney could move up to 140, drop all his belts. People are still talking about Gervonta Davis got to make the fight with him, even though they know Gervonta Davis is the A side of the situation. But then people will turn around and sit up there and say, why David Benavidez ain't do this, that, and the third. To make, because they know Canelo's the cash cow. Canelo the A side. Canelo don't need David Benavidez. They understand that when it comes to Canelo. Devin Haney and Gervonta Davis could be in the same situation, and nobody understands that now. All of a sudden, he got to make the fight happen. He the A side. He need Devin. But then to tell me Canelo don't need David Benavidez. We don't actually want the best fighters fighting. We want to argue about the best fighters fighting. That is much more entertaining. You got people out here that's actually not going to hold Shakur Stevenson accountable if this fight with Gervonta Davis don't fall through. You got people out here that's actually not going to hold Gervonta Davis accountable if the Shakur Stevenson fight don't fall through. When they both are equally responsible in their perspective, in their objective positions. Shakur Stevenson being the A side has to understand that he's the A side and be willing to take his biggest, highest guaranteed ever in a nice percentage of the pay-per-view, anywhere between 10 to 20%. Anything extra, he's asking way too much for that. He's not worth that. He's never been on pay-per-view or any of that. He didn't sell out his last fight. He's on the downslide as far as the public perception is concerned. All of that is true, and Shakur Stevenson has to understand that because he can't act like that's not true about the public, because then he wouldn't be out here responding to everything now, would he? Something's going on while he got to respond to everybody. So Gervonta Davis is just as responsible in his perspective, objective position of being the A side. Hey, Gervonta, you got to go and make sure that your people get in contact with Shakur Stevenson's people. Let them know where y'all coming from. Try to set up negotiations, and then we can take it there. Because now once we get to that step, the responsibility now is on Shakur Stevenson. See, everybody plays a part. But we don't actually want the best fighters fighting. We want to argue about the best fighters fighting. And that's the problem with boxing right there. That's the problem with boxing right there. Was Terrence Crawford doing some backhanded things in negotiations? Absolutely. It's still Earl Smith's responsibility to try to make that fight happen if he could, even if he would have took another fight or whatever, even if they wouldn't have fought till last year, whatever. I mean, or this year, or sometime in the last 6-7 months, because it would have got pushed back. Whenever it was still, he would still have a responsibility of being a big player and making that fight happen with Terrence Crawford. What Terrence Crawford does, we will hold him accountable. What you do, we gonna hold you accountable. It ain't on one responsibility or the other. This is not a parent and a child. These are grown men who sign contracts, who make millions of dollars, who run their mouth on social media. What I've come to realize is we don't want the best fighters fighting. We like to argue about the best fighters fighting. And that's the problem with boxing and why these fights don't get done. What's good for the goose has to be good for the gander. If Lomachenko gets an excuse to be understood about why he don't want to fight Gervonta Davis, then Gervonta Davis, being the big A side, definitely deserves that excuse, don't you think? He's earned it, obviously. He's a bigger star than Lomachenko, so whenever he decides that he want to spend time with his family and don't want to fight somebody, I don't want to hear that he's a duck from people who trying to be understanding towards Lomachenko. Okay? I don't want to hear none of that. You can't have it both ways. You have to pick one. You can't be like Devin is the B side, the clear B side, but it's all on the A side guy to make XYZ fights happen. But David Benavidez can be the clear B side, and then y'all still trash David Benavidez and give Canelo an excuse when he's the A side. You don't put that responsibility on him. And understand this, y'all. Whatever side of the fence you was on any of these arguments, that's your own personal opinion or whatever. I'm just talking about arguments in totality. Y'all don't understand the word I'm trying to get out my mouth. In totality, whatever. Y'all understand. That's where I'm coming from. You have to pick a perspective. You have to pick a side that you're going to stay on and have your own thoughts. And stick with that, whether it's your favorite fighter doing some stuff that's backhanded or a fighter you don't like, whether it's a guy that you cool with or you really do enjoy watching fighting or you don't. Just because Devin Haney is somebody I don't like don't mean that it's okay for Ryan Garcia to test positive and may have cheat the man. I don't care if Gervonta Davis popped for PEDs. That is my favorite fighter. If he ever popped for PEDs, he need to be away for the sport and be ashamed of himself. If things like that ever happen, see, you got to have a consistent perspective on what your views are and where you stand. But I realize why y'all don't, because we don't want to see the best fighters fighting. We just want to argue about the best fighters fighting. Your pride, your being right in an argument is much more important than actually getting to the solution, actually getting to the conclusion, actually getting to the end result. And that's the biggest problem with boxing right there. Y'all already know what this is. Dame by any means. And I'll holla at y'all.